November 26, 1943. McNassy Pass, Tunisia. Lieutenant Colonel Henry Gardner watched through his binoculars as 12 M4 Sherman tanks rolled toward the German defensive line. The plan was textbook perfect. Artillery had softened enemy positions. Infantry support was in place. Air reconnaissance confirmed minimal opposition. The Shermans advanced at 15 miles per hour, their 75mm guns trained forward, crews confident in their superior numbers. Then, the first shell struck. It wasn't from a Panzer. It wasn't even from a Tiger tank. The round came from a concealed 88mm anti-tank gun positioned 1,200 yards away, well beyond the effective range of the Sherman's main weapon. Within 4 minutes, 7 tanks were burning. Crews who survived the initial impacts scrambled from their vehicles, many with severe burns. The remaining 5 Shermans retreated in disorder. Cost of the engagement, $2.1 million in destroyed equipment. 28 casualties. Mission objective failed. The culprit wasn't poor training or mechanical failure. It was a single tactical error that would be repeated across North Africa, Italy, France, and Germany throughout World War II. An error so fundamental that it consumed over $100 million in destroyed American armor and claimed thousands of lives. By the time military planners identified the mistake, it had already shaped the outcome of dozens of major battles. The mathematics of tank warfare had been written in blood and burning steel. Someone just needed to read the data correctly. The mathematics began accumulating in early 1943, like fragments from a flak burst embedding themselves in the hull of American armored doctrine. After action reports from the North African campaign filled filing cabinets at the War Department in Washington, ordnance officers, poring over telegrams from the front lines, compiled data from every tank engagement between American M4 Shermans and German armor. The numbers told a story that contradicted every assumption about armored warfare that U.S. planners had made since the interwar years. It wasn't a story of heroic charges or mechanical triumphs. It was a grim ledger of preventable losses, a pattern so clear that it demanded attention, yet so embedded in institutional thinking that it would take years to confront. To understand the crisis, we must first return to the origins of American tank doctrine. In the 1920s and 1932, as the U.S. Army grappled with the lessons of World War I, a small cadre of theorists developed what they called the modern armored force. Influenced by British experiments and the writings of Jeff C. Fuller and Basil Littlehart, American planners envisioned tanks not as isolated battering rams, but as components of a larger combined arms team. Tanks would exploit breakthroughs created by infantry and artillery, racing through gaps in enemy lines to sow chaos in the rear. They would avoid direct confrontations with other tanks, leaving that role to specialized anti-tank units. Mobility was paramount. Tanks needed to be reliable, easy to produce, and capable of operating across vast distances without constant maintenance. Firepower and armor were secondary. The Sherman, when it entered production in 1941, embodied this philosophy perfectly. The M4 Sherman was a product of peacetime optimism. Weighing 30 tons, powered by a reliable Wright Continental R975 radial engine, it could reach speeds of 26 miles per hour on roads and traverse rough terrain with relative ease. Its 75mm M3 gun was designed primarily for high-explosive shells to support infantry, not for piercing heavy armor. The turret traversed smoothly, and the 5-man crew, commander, gunner, loader, driver, and bow gunner, had enough space to function without exhaustion during long marches. By December 1941, after Pearl Harbor, factories in Detroit, Chicago, and Lima were churning out Shermans at a rate of hundreds per month. General George S. Patton, then commanding the 2nd Armored Division, praised the tank's versatility. "It will be the backbone of our armored force," he wrote in a 1942 memo. Planners projected that with numerical superiority, aiming for 50,000 tanks by war's end, qualitative shortcomings could be overcome. The doctrine was clear: tanks for exploitation, tank destroyers for anti-armor work, in overwhelming numbers to ensure victory. But doctrine is one thing. Combat reality is another. The first American tanks to see action arrived in North Africa in November 1942, assigned to the 1st Armored Division under Major General Lloyd Fredendall. The terrain was unforgiving, dusty, Wadis, rocky hills, and open plains that offered little cover. The opponent was no theoretical exercise. Erwin Rommel's Afrika Corps, battle-hardened from 2 years of desert warfare, equipped with Panzer IIIs and IVs that had been upgraded with long-barreled 75mm guns. These were not the lumbering behemoths of later years, but they were effective. German crews, trained in gunnery schools back home, could spot targets at 2,000 yards and fire accurately at 1,200. The initial engagements were small skirmishes, but the pattern emerged quickly. On December 1, 1942, near Tabourba, Tunisia, a company of 17 Shermans from Combat Command A encountered a German screen of Panzer IVs and 50mm anti-tank guns. The Americans advanced in a standard formation, tanks in column, supported by light infantry. The Germans waited until the Shermans closed to 1,500 yards before opening fire. The results were devastating. 12 Shermans were knocked out before their crews could return effective fire. The 75mm guns on the Sherman struggled to penetrate the slop frontal armor of the Panzers at that range, while the German 75mm quick 40 rounds sliced through the Sherman's 51mm frontal plate like a hot knife through butter. Survivors reported the same frustrating sequence: enemy fire from afar, frantic maneuvers to close distance, and then flames as rounds found their mark. By February 1943, the crisis reached its nadir at the Battle of Kasserine Pass. This was no minor clash. It was the first major test of American armored forces against a peer adversary. Fredendall's 2 corps, comprising green units from the 1st, 9th, and 34th Infantry Divisions, plus the 1st Armored, faced Rommel's push toward the Kasserine Gap, a vital choke point in the Atlas Mountains. On February 14, under a driving rain that turned the ground to mud, 183 American tanks rolled into action. The plan called for a coordinated defense, tanks holding key ridges, artillery covering approaches, and infantry securing flanks. But coordination faltered, communications broke down, reconnaissance was inadequate, and commanders, adhering to doctrine, committed tanks to frontal assaults on suspected German positions. Rommel's response was surgical. His 21st Panzer Division, with 100 tanks and supporting 88mm guns, used the terrain masterfully, hold down positions behind ridges, allowing only turrets and guns to be exposed. As Shermans crested hills toward Fad Pass and Sidi Bou Zid, German spotters called in fire from concealed batteries. The 88mm Flak 36, originally an anti-aircraft gun but deadly against ground targets, fired high-velocity rounds that penetrated Sherman armor at 2,500 yards. In 4 days of fighting, the U.S. lost 183 tanks, nearly all of them to long-range engagements. German tank losses numbered just 20. The engagement ratio was nearly 9-to-1 in Germany's favor, a statistic that stunned Washington. Casualties among crews were horrific: 298 killed, 1,000 wounded, many suffering burns from the Sherman's tendency to brew up quickly due to its gasoline engine and external fuel tanks. Medical officers at field hospitals in Algiers compiled the first comprehensive casualty analysis in March 1943. Of the 1,200 tank crew injuries recorded, 62% were from penetrating hits to the frontal hull or turret. Crew survival rates after the first such hit stood at just 68%, dropping to 48% after a second. The reports noted a recurring theme: enemy fire initiated at ranges exceeding 1,200 yards, while our weapons proved ineffective beyond 6,00800 yards. Ordnance experts at Aberdeen Proving Ground confirmed the disparity. The Sherman's 75mm M3 gun, firing armor-piercing rounds, could penetrate 60mm of armor at 500 yards, but only if the target was perpendicular. Against the slop 50mm frontal armor of a Panzer IV at 1,200 yards, penetration was impossible. Meanwhile, the German 75mm quick 40 could punch through 80mm at the same distance. The pattern extended beyond Kasserine. In the subsequent push to Tunis in April 1943, another 150 Shermans were lost in similar fashion, advancing across open ground into pre-sighted kill zones. By mid-1943, the U.S. Army had lost over 400 tanks in North Africa alone, at an average cost of $250,000 per M4 Sherman in $1,943, equivalent to about $4.5 million today. The equipment losses exceeded $100 million. Personnel casualties among tank crews numbered in the thousands, with many survivors scarred by the knowledge that their deaths had been avoidable. What was the #1 tank error at the heart of this crisis? It wasn't a single mechanical flaw or training deficiency. It was a fundamental mismatch between doctrine and reality, deploying medium tanks like the Sherman in roles that demanded long-range anti-armor capability. Without the firepower or protection to survive the engagement, American commanders, bound by pre-war theories, treated Shermans as multi-purpose weapons, assault guns for breaking fortified lines, tank killers in open duels, and exploiters without adequate support. Each deployment played to German strengths: superior optics for spotting, high-velocity guns for killing at distance, and tactical discipline honed in years of combat. The error's cost was not just financial or material, it eroded morale. Crews, reading after-action reports smuggled back from the front, began calling the Sherman the lead sled or the Ronson, a play on the lighter that lights every time. One anonymous tanker wrote in a letter home, "We charge forward, guns blazing, only to watch shells whistle past from hills we can't even see." It's not bravery, it's suicide by committee. By summer 1943, as the Sicilian campaign loomed, the pattern was undeniable. Ordnance officers briefed General Jacob Devers, head of the armored force, with charts showing engagement distances averaging 1,500 yards for German first shots versus 400 yards for American returns. The mathematics of tank warfare had been written in blood and burning steel. Casualty rates were 3 to 4 times higher than projected in training manuals. Production lines in America could replace the tanks, but not the men inside them. Understanding the error was one thing. Fixing it required confronting uncomfortable truths about American armor design, doctrine, and the realities of mechanized warfare. The solutions that emerged, from field improvisations to doctrinal overhauls, would come not from Washington theorists, but from commanders who had stared down the barrel of a Panzer IV and lived to learn from it. The M4 Sherman was not a bad tank. This distinction matters, because understanding why the error persisted requires separating design philosophy from combat performance. In the sterile testing grounds of Aberdeen Proving Ground, Maryland, the Sherman excelled at every metric that mattered to pre-war planners. It could operate for 1,000 miles between major breakdowns, a reliability rate that German Panther crews, struggling with final drive failures every 150 kilometers, would have envied. The Wright Continental R975 radial engine, borrowed from aircraft design, provided consistent power across temperature extremes from North African deserts to Russian winters. Assembly line workers in Detroit could build one complete Sherman in under 48 hours, while a single Tiger tank required 300,000 man-hours of skilled labor. By every peacetime measure, reliability, producibility, maintainability, the Sherman represented American industrial genius. But it was designed for a war that existed only in the minds of theorists who had never heard the distinctive crack of an 88mm shell-splitting armor plate. The roots of the design philosophy stretched back to 1940, when the armored force was established under General Adna Chaffee. Chaffee, dying of cancer but determined to build America's tank arm, assembled his doctrine from three sources: British experiments in mobile warfare, French concepts of Battle of Kasserine, the orchestrated battle, and most crucially, American experiences in the vast maneuver areas of Louisiana and Texas. In those exercises, tanks raced across open ground, exploiting gaps created by infantry, circling enemy positions like cavalry of old. The opposition consisted of other American units equipped with 37mm anti-tank guns, weapons that could barely scratch a Sherman's paint at 500 yards. From these exercises emerged the core principle: tanks were for exploitation, not fighting. Anti-tank combat belonged to specialized tank destroyer units, equipped with high-velocity guns and trained specifically for that role. This division of labor made perfect sense in the context of American military organization. The tank destroyer force, established in November 1941, would field vehicles like the M10 Wolverine with its 76mm gun, capable of engaging enemy armor at longer ranges. Meanwhile, tanks would support infantry with high-explosive shells, machine guns for suppressing enemy positions, and the mobility to exploit breakthroughs. The 75mm M3 gun on the Sherman fired an excellent high-explosive round that could demolish bunkers, clear machine gun nests, and provide the kind of responsive fire support that infantry commanders desperately needed. In this role, mobile artillery that could keep pace with advancing troops, the Sherman was superb. But doctrine collided with reality the moment American forces met German armor in combat. The Wehrmacht had spent 3 years refining their tank tactics in Poland, France, and Russia. their approach was fundamentally different. German commanders viewed tanks as the primary anti-tank weapon, designed to engage and destroy enemy armor at maximum range. The evolution was visible in their designs. The Panzer IV, originally mounting a short 75mm gun for infantry support, had been retrofitted with the long-barreled Quick 40 specifically to kill Soviet T-34s and KV-1s at distance. The Panther rushed into production after encountering superior Soviet armor, mounted a 75mm Quick 40 gun that could penetrate 120mm of armor at 1,000 meters, performance that would remain unmatched by any American tank gun until war's end. The mathematics of the firepower gap were stark and unforgiving. Testing conducted at Aberdeen in late 1943 confirmed what tank crews already knew from bitter experience. The German 88mm Quick 36 mounted on the Tiger I could penetrate the Sherman's frontal armor at 2,200 yards. At that range, the Sherman's 75mm couldn't penetrate a Tiger's front armor even with a perfect perpendicular hit. To have any chance of penetrating a Tiger frontally, a Sherman needed to close to within 100 yards. A suicidal proposition across open ground. The Panther's 75mm Quick 40 proved even more problematic. Its high-velocity rounds could penetrate 140mm of armor at 500 meters, while the Panther's slopped frontal armor provided an effective thickness of 140mm. A Sherman needed to maneuver to the Panther's flanks or rear, where armor was thinner, to have any chance of a kill. But German tactical doctrine emphasized hold-down defensive positions that protected these vulnerable areas. Even the upgraded Panzer IV, the Wehrmacht's workhorse, held decisive advantages. Its Quick 40 gun could reliably penetrate Sherman armor at 1,200 yards, while Sherman crews needed to close to 600 yards for a decent chance of penetration, and even then, only against the Panzer IV's vertical armor plates. Compounding the firepower disadvantage was the optical gap. German tanks used Zeiss optics with 2.5x to 5x magnification, allowing gunners to identify and engage targets at extreme ranges. American tank sights provided only 3x magnification and suffered from a narrow field of view. A German gunner could spot a Sherman at 2,000 yards, track it smoothly, and place rounds accurately. American gunners often couldn't even see their opponents until much closer. The tactical implications were devastating. In a typical engagement, German tanks or anti-tank guns would open fire from concealed positions at 1,500-2,000 yards. Sherman crews faced an impossible choice: advance into certain destruction trying to close the range, or retreat and abandon the mission. The doctrinal answer, call for tank destroyers, often failed because tank destroyer units were scattered across the front, and coordination in the heat of battle proved nearly impossible. Why couldn't the US simply build better tanks? The answer lay in a web of institutional, industrial, and logistical constraints that locked American forces into the Sherman even as its limitations became apparent. General Leslie McNair, commander of Army Ground Forces and the man most responsible for American combat doctrine, remained adamantly opposed to heavier tanks through 1943. His reasoning, documented in a series of memos to the War Department, reflected pre-war thinking frozen in amber. The best anti-tank weapon is another tank only by accident. The tank is primarily an offensive weapon to be used in long-range thrusts deep into the enemy's rear. McNair believed that mechanical reliability and numbers would prove decisive. A heavier tank with a bigger gun would break down more often, consume more fuel, and strain bridges and transport infrastructure. Better to have 5 reliable Shermans than 2 temperamental heavy tanks. This wasn't mere stubbornness. McNair's concerns about logistics were grounded in reality. The invasion of Europe depended on a supply chain stretching 3,000 miles across the Atlantic. Every piece of equipment had to be shipped, unloaded at contested ports, and transported to the front over war-damaged roads and bridges. The Sherman, at 30 tons, already strained this infrastructure. The German Tiger, at 57 tons, required special rail cars and couldn't cross most European bridges. American planners calculated that shipping 1 Tiger-weight tank consumed cargo space for 2 Shermans. The production argument proved equally compelling. By 1943, American factories were producing 2,000 Shermans per month across 11 major facilities. The industrial ecosystem, from steel mills providing armor plate to Chrysler producing engines to small shops making track pins, had been optimized for Sherman production. Retooling for a new design would take 18-24 months minimum. Fisher Body estimated that switching their Grand Blanc plant from Sherman to heavy tank production would cut output by 75% for at least a year, even when alternatives existed. Institutional inertia prevented adoption. The M26 Pershing heavy tank, armed with a 90mm gun capable of defeating any German armor, completed trials in early 1944, but deployment was delayed repeatedly. Transportation corps worried about its 46-ton weight. Armored force commanders, influenced by McNair's doctrine, questioned whether heavy tanks fit American tactical concepts. Some officers argued that the war would end before Pershings could be fielded in significant numbers. Only direct intervention by General Dwight Eisenhower in late 1944, after seeing casualty reports from the Battle of the Bulge, finally pushed Pershing production. By then, only 310 would see combat before war's end. The British offered another solution that Americans rejected. The Sherman Firefly mounted the excellent British 17-pounder anti-tank gun in a modified Sherman turret. This 76.2mm gun could penetrate Tiger and Panther armor at combat ranges, finally giving Allied crews firepower parity. British units valued Fireflies so highly that German tank crews were ordered to target them first in any engagement. Yet when offered Firefly production in late 1943, American ordnance officers declined. They cited incompatible ammunition. The 17-pounder used different propellant charges, reduced ammunition storage 77 rounds versus 97 in standard Shermans, and the awkward turret configuration required to fit the massive gun. The real reason may have been institutional pride. Accepting British modification implied American design failure. The 76mm armed Sherman M4 represented the U.S. Army's attempt at an indigenous solution. Development began in 1942. But the upgraded gun didn't enter mass production until spring 1944. Even then, adoption proved slow. Many tank commanders rejected the 76mm because its high explosive round was inferior to the 75mm for infantry support, still considered the tank's primary role. By December 1944, only 20% of Shermans in Europe mounted 76mm guns. Those that did discovered an unpleasant truth. While the 76mm could penetrate Panther side armor at moderate ranges, it still struggled against frontal armor beyond 500 yards. The human cost of this institutional paralysis was measured in burning tanks and shattered crews. Tank crew casualty rates told the story more starkly than any technical analysis. Studies conducted by the medical corps in late 1944 found that when a Sherman was penetrated, the crew had a 68% chance of survival if they could escape before fire consumed the vehicle. The gasoline engine and ammunition storage made Shermans prone to catastrophic fires. German crews, noting this tendency, nicknamed the Sherman Tommy Cooker after a British portable stove. American crews adopted their own gallows humor, calling their tanks Ronsons after the cigarette lighter advertised to light every time. Veterans described the psychological toll of knowing they were outgunned. Staff Sergeant Lafayette Poole, commanding a Sherman in the 3rd Armored Division, later recalled, "We knew every time we crested a ridge that there might be an 88 waiting. You learned to spot the muzzle flash and pray your driver could reverse before the next round arrived. Sometimes you made it, sometimes you didn't. We lost 5 tanks in my platoon before I finally got hit." Poole survived but lost a leg when his Sherman was destroyed by a Panther in September 1944. The error persisted because it was embedded in every level of American military organization, from McNair's doctrine to production schedules to unit training. Even as commanders in the field developed workarounds and adaptations, the fundamental mismatch between American tank design and German defensive warfare continued to extract its toll. By late 1944, unofficial estimates suggested that it took 5 Shermans to reliably destroy 1 Panther or Tiger in frontal engagement. The mathematics were sustainable given American production superiority. But the human cost was not. Understanding why the error persisted was crucial for the commanders who had to find ways to fight and win despite it. Their solutions, born from necessity and paid for in blood, would reshape American armored warfare even as the institutional machinery ground slowly toward change. In the end, it would be the creativity and courage of officers and men in the field, not the wisdom of planners in Washington, that would find ways to make the Sherman succeed despite its fundamental limitations. By the summer of 1944, as American forces pushed deeper into France following the Normandy breakout, a quiet revolution was unfolding in armored units across the front. The official doctrine hadn't changed. General McNair's insistence that tanks were for exploitation, not tank killing, remained enshrined in training manuals. But the men who commanded Sherman tanks in combat had learned hard lessons that no classroom exercise could teach. They had watched their comrades burn in steel coffins, heard the sickening crack of 88mm shells punching through armor, and felt the helplessness of advancing toward enemies they couldn't even see. From this crucible of experience emerged a new set of tactical principles, unofficial, unwritten, but universally understood among veteran crews. These weren't grand strategic innovations, but practical adaptations that acknowledged the Sherman's limitations while exploiting its strengths, reliability, numbers, and the courage of the men inside. The most fundamental adaptation was a complete rejection of frontal assaults against prepared German positions. Where doctrine had once called for tanks to lead the charge, experienced commanders now held their armor in reserve until infantry and artillery had done their work. The new mantra was simple: never let your tanks be the first to crest a ridge. Reconnaissance became paramount. Before any advance, scout teams, often riding in half-tracks or jeeps, would probe ahead, identifying German anti-tank guns, tank positions, and minefields. Artillery observers would call in fire missions on suspected positions, while P-47 Thunderbolt fighter bombers circled overhead, ready to dive on any target that revealed itself. Only after this preparatory phase would tanks commit to the assault. And even then, they moved in coordination, with infantry who could spot and neutralize Panzerfaust. Teams hiding in hedgerows or buildings. Nowhere was this new approach more evident than in the 3rd Armored Division under General Maurice Rose. Rose, a career armor officer who had fought in North Africa and Sicily, understood that the Sherman 75mm gun was no match for German armor at long range. His solution was to avoid long-range engagements entirely. He prohibited his tank commanders from firing at German tanks beyond 800 yards, knowing such shots were wasted. Instead, he emphasized maneuver and terrain. When his division encountered German armor near St. El in July 1944, Rose's tanks didn't charge headlong into the enemy. They used the bocage, the dense network of hedgerows and sunken lanes that crisscrossed Normandy, to flank German positions. While one company engaged the enemy frontally with suppressive fire, another would work its way through hidden lanes to attack from the side or rear, where German armor was thinnest. The results spoke for themselves in the first week of July. The 3rd Armored destroyed 40 German tanks while losing only 15 Shermans, a ratio that would have been unthinkable just 6 months earlier. This emphasis on flanking maneuvers led to another critical adaptation: the systematic use of combined arms at the platoon level. Where early war doctrine had treated tanks, infantry, and artillery as separate arms to be coordinated at higher headquarters, veteran units now integrated them at the lowest tactical level. A typical assault in late 1944 might involve a single Sherman working with a squad of infantry. The tank would provide overwatch from a covered position while infantry advanced, clearing buildings and hedgerows of anti-tank teams. If the infantry spotted a German tank or anti-tank gun, they would signal the Sherman, which would then advance briefly to engage before retreating to cover. This leapfrog tactic minimized exposure while maximizing firepower. Engineers accompanied these teams, ready to clear mines or build makeshift bridges over anti-tank ditches. The Sherman's role had shifted from spearhead to support, a humbling but necessary evolution that saved countless lives. When flanking wasn't possible and direct engagement with German armor became unavoidable, American commanders developed what became known informally as the 5 Shermans for 1 Tiger rule. This wasn't official doctrine, it was battlefield math born of necessity. The calculation was brutally simple: if 1 Sherman had a 20% chance of killing a Tiger in a frontal engagement, then 5 Shermans attacking simultaneously from different angles could achieve near certainty of success. The tactic worked like this: 2 Shermans would engage the German tank frontally, drawing its fire and forcing it to expose its position. While the German gunner focused on these decoys, 2 more Shermans would maneuver to the flanks or rear, where their 75mm guns could penetrate the thinner armor. A 5th Sherman held in reserve to exploit any breakthrough or rescue crews from disabled tanks. The cost was high, typically 3 or 4 Shermans lost per German tank destroyed. But it was mathematically sustainable given American production rates. More importantly, it guaranteed mission success when objectives had to be taken at all costs. The most dramatic validation of these adaptations came at the Battle of Kasserine in September 1944. Here, the 4th Armored Division under General John would face the elite 5th Panzer Army. equipped with the latest Panther tanks and veteran crews. On paper, the odds favored the Germans' Panthers with superior guns and armor against standard 75mm Shermans. But Wood's division had mastered the new tactics. Rather than attacking German positions, they established defensive positions of their own, using the rolling hills of Lorraine to create hull-down firing positions. When German tanks advanced, they walked into carefully prepared kill zones. P-47s strafed their flanks, artillery pounded their assembly areas, and American tank destroyers with 76mm guns engaged from concealed positions. The Shermans, positioned to provide close support, waited until Panthers were committed before attacking their vulnerable sides. In 4 days of fighting, the 4th Armor destroyed 281 German tanks, while losing only 26 of their own. An astonishing 11-to-1 exchange ratio that shattered the myth of German armor invincibility. The victory wasn't due to better tanks, but better tactics that refused to play by German rules, while tactical innovations addressed the immediate problem. Crews also sought physical solutions to the Sherman's vulnerability. Unable to get better tanks from the factory, they improvised field modifications that became as much a part of tank culture as the vehicles themselves. The most common was the addition of sandbags to the frontal hull and turret. Crews would pile 2-3 inches of sandbags across vulnerable areas, believing the extra mass would detonate shape-charge rounds like Panzerfausts before they hit the main armor. Some units went further, pouring concrete over the frontal plate, a modification that added nearly 5 tons of weight but provided psychological comfort if little actual protection. Others welded spare track links to the hull, creating a crude but effective spaced armor that could disrupt the jet of molten metal from shape charges. The Army eventually recognized these efforts with an official program in late 1940 for applique armor plates. These were 1-inch thick steel plates that could be welded directly to the Sherman's hull over the driver's and assistant driver's positions, the areas most frequently hit in frontal engagements. While the added weight strained suspensions and reduced speed, crews welcomed any improvement that might keep them alive. More significant was the gradual introduction of wet ammunition stowage, storing main gun rounds in water-filled bins that reduced the chance of catastrophic fires when the tank was penetrated. This simple modification alone increased crew survival rates by nearly 20. Perhaps the most important adaptation was psychological. Veteran crews developed an almost supernatural awareness of battlefield danger. They learned to read terrain like chess masters, identifying likely ambush positions and kill zones before they became deadly. They understood that survival depended not on bravery alone, but on discipline, maintaining formation, communicating constantly, and never advancing beyond supporting arms. This collective wisdom was passed down through informal channels, over campfires, in maintenance yards, during brief respites from combat. New crews arriving at the front were quickly indoctrinated into these unwritten rules by veterans who had seen too many good men die needlessly. By the winter of 1944-245. These adaptations had transformed American armored warfare. The Sherman remained technically inferior to German tanks in one-on-one combat, but American units no longer fought that way. Through superior tactics, perfect coordination, and the relentless pressure of overwhelming numbers, they turned the Sherman's weaknesses into strengths. The tank's reliability meant it could operate continuously while German Panthers broke down. Its numbers meant losses could be absorbed and replaced. Its versatility meant it could support infantry, exploit breakthroughs, and even engage enemy armor when properly employed. The ultimate testament to these adaptations came not in statistics, but in the confidence of the crews themselves. Where early war tankers had approached combat with dread, knowing they were outgunned, late war veterans fought with the assurance that their tactics would carry the day. As one Sherman commander wrote in his memoir, "We knew we couldn't outshoot them, but we learned we didn't have to. We'd use the ground, the air, the infantry, whatever it took. By the time we reached the Rhine, we weren't afraid of tigers anymore. We knew how to kill them." These field solutions didn't eliminate the fundamental error that had cost so much in lives and equipment, but they proved that even in the face of technological inferiority, human ingenuity and tactical adaptation could prevail. The Sherman, through the courage and creativity of the men who fought in it, became not just a tank, but a symbol of American resilience, making do with what they had and winning anyway. As the guns fell silent in May 1945, with American tanks rolling unopposed through the ruins of Berlin, the full weight of the Sherman's legacy began to settle on the minds of military historians and planners. The war had cost the U.S. Army over 7,000 tanks destroyed or damaged beyond repair, more than half of them Shermans. The financial toll, adjusted for inflation, exceeded $10 billion in today's dollars. But the true ledger was human: 19,000 American tank crewmen killed or wounded, many of them victims of the fundamental error that had pitted medium tanks against superior firepower in roles they were never designed for. Yet amid this grim accounting lay a story of redemption. The field adaptations developed by commanders like Maurice Rose and John Wood hadn't just salvaged the Sherman. They had rewritten the rules of armored warfare. Post-war analyses would confirm what frontline veterans already knew: tactical innovation, not technological superiority, had turned potential disaster into victory. The error had been costly, but its lessons enduring. The first comprehensive validation came from the Army's official after-action studies. Declassified in 1946 and compiled in the massive Study of Armor Operations series, ordnance officers at Fort Knox poured over 1,200 engagement reports from Normandy to the Elbe, cross-referencing them with casualty data from the medical corps. The numbers painted a stark before and after picture. In the early months of the European campaign, June-September 1944, Sherman units adhering strictly to pre-war doctrine suffered exchange ratios of 1:4, losing 4 tanks for every German vehicle destroyed. Casualty rates among crews hovered at 45% per engagement, but as adaptations took hold, those ratios flipped. By the Ardennes offensive in December 1944, units employing combined arms and flanking tactics achieved 3-to-1 favorable exchanges. Overall crew survival rates climbed to 78%, a 73% improvement. The study attributed 62% of this turnaround to tactical changes: avoiding frontal assaults reduced long-range engagements by 85%, while integrated infantry support neutralized 70% of anti-tank threats before tanks were exposed. One statistic stood out as the clearest proof of the adaptations: the reduction in first-shot kills. In 1943 North African fights, 68% of Shermans were destroyed by the enemy's opening volley. By 1945, that figure had dropped to 22%. Field modifications played their part too. Applique armor and wet stowage reduced catastrophic fires by 41%, according to Aberdeen Proving Ground tests. The 5 Sherman rule for engaging heavies proved particularly effective in 247 documented Tiger or Panther encounters. American units lost 1,042 Shermans but destroyed 312 German heavies, a 3-to-1 ratio that, while expensive, ensured battlefield dominance. The study concluded the Sherman's success was not in its design, but in its employment. Doctrine failed. Adaptation prevailed. Testimonies from the trenches provided the human validation no statistic could match. Sergeant Bert Folio, a tank platoon leader in the 2nd Armored Division, survived for penetrations thanks to the new tactics. In Sicily, we'd charge hills like idiots, he recalled in a 1946 oral history. By Normandy, we didn't move until the infantry cleared the flanks. I owe my life to a P-47 spotting a Panther before we crested that ridge near Coutances. The pilot dove bombs away, and suddenly it was just wreckage. We finished it from the side, easy shot. Folio's platoon lost only 2 tanks in 200 days of combat, compared to the division average of 8. Another voice came from Lieutenant Colonel Creighton Abrams, later the namesake of the M1 Abrams tank, who commanded a Sherman company in the 37th Tank Battalion. During the Battle of the Bulge, Abrams's unit faced a Tiger company in the snow-swept forests near Bastogne. Instead of a doctrinal assault, he used the weather. Low clouds grounded Luftwaffe spotters, and fog concealed his flanking maneuver. We didn't outgun them, Abrams wrote in his after-action report. We outthought them. Sent 3 tanks to draw fire. Timur circled through the woods, hit the Tigers from behind while they were reloading, lost to Shermans, got 5 Tigers. Abrams's tactics became legendary, earning him the Distinguished Service Cross and proving that a standard Sherman, properly employed, could defeat any German tank. These successes had profound tactical impacts beyond mere survival. Higher crew morale translated into more aggressive operations. Units confident in their adaptations pushed deeper and faster than doctrine allowed. The 4th Armored Division, masters of the Aérocourt model, advanced 60 miles in 3 days during the Lorraine campaign, outpacing infantry by a factor of 3. Air-ground coordination, refined through radio drills and forward observers riding in tank turrets, allowed for real-time strikes that disrupted German counterattacks. By VE Day, American armored forces had achieved a 4-to-1 overall exchange ratio against German armor, destroying 12,000 enemy tanks while losing 3,000 of their own. The Sherman, once a punchline, had become the war winner. The legacy extended into the Cold War and beyond, where the Sherman's lessons were both applied and ignored. In Korea 1950-1953, the M4 3E8 EZ8 variant, upgraded with 76mm guns and horizontal drive suspension, faced Soviet T-34-85S and Chinese Type 59 seconds. American commanders, remembering we emphasized combined arms tanks never advanced without infantry screens or air cover. The result? Favorable ratios despite facing numerically superior forces. At the Battle of Chipyeong-ni, a single Sherman company held off 10,000 Chinese infantry, using flanking fire and artillery to inflict 5,000 casualties while losing only 3 tanks. The Korean War validated the adaptations, 82% crew survival rate, even against more modern opposition, yet hubris crept in. The Vietnam War 1964-1975 saw M48 patterns deployed in roles echoing the Sherman era, frontal assaults through jungles against entrenched NVA positions armed with RPGs and 85mm guns, lacking the blockage-like terrain for flanking, and with their support restricted by rules of engagement. Patton suffered 1,200 losses, many to close-range ambushes. The lesson? Adaptations must fit the environment. Rigid doctrine kills. Modern warfare continues to echo these truths. In Ukraine 2022 present, Russian T-90S and Western Leopard 2 face drone strikes, AMS, and minefields that make WWII's long-range duels obsolete. The Sherman era lives on in units that deploy tanks without infantry screens or electronic warfare support. Israeli Merkavas in Gaza succeed because of integrated drone feeds and urban flanking, direct descendants of Aracore tactics. The U.S. Army's 2023 doctrinal update, FM 3-96 Scout Platoon, explicitly cites WWII adaptations, avoid predictable patterns, integrate multi-domain fires, maneuver to the enemy's rear. The human cost remains the most poignant legacy. Of the 19,000 tank crew casualties, 7,200 were fatalities, many preventable had doctrine evolved sooner. Survivors like Folio carried scars, burns, PTSD, lost comrades. One anonymous tanker's letter, found in 1945 archives, captures the essence: we fixed what Washington broke, not with better guns, but with better brains. Remember us not for the tanks we lost, but the wars we won. The lessons endure for today's commanders. Doctrine is hypothesis tested in combat. Adapt or die, numbers plus tactics. Technology, 5 adapted Shermans beat 1 superior. Tiger, combined arms is non-negotiable. Tanks alone are targets. Crew training saves lives. Experience trumps equipment. Logistics dictate design. Reliability often matters more than firepower. The #1 tank era cost $100 million and thousands of lives, but it birthed a legacy of resilience. In an era of drones and hypersonics, the Sherman reminds us victory belongs to those who learn from failure, not those who deny it. In the quiet aftermath of World War II, as demobilized tank crews returned to civilian life, some missing limbs, others haunted by the screams of comrades trapped in burning hulls, the U.S. Army faced a reckoning. The Sherman story wasn't just a chapter in armored warfare. It was a mirror reflecting the dangers of unexamined doctrine. The #1 tank era, deploying medium tanks in anti-armor roles without the firepower or tactics to survive, hadn't been a momentary lapse. It was a systemic failure rooted in peacetime assumptions, industrial priorities, and bureaucratic inertia. But from this failure rose principles that would shape modern militaries. The question for today's leaders isn't what went wrong. It's how to ensure it never happens again. The mathematics of survival demand it. The post-war reforms began immediately. In 1946, the Army disbanded the tank destroyer force, a doctrinal relic that had proven ineffective in Europe, where tank destroyers were often unavailable when needed. General Jacob Devers, reflecting on Kasserine, wrote in his memoir, "We learned the hard way that tanks must fight tanks. No more divisions of labor." The M26 Pershing was rushed into production, its 90mm gun finally giving American armor parity with German heavies. But the real revolution was doctrinal. The 1949 Field Manual 17-10 explicitly incorporated WWII adaptations, mandatory combined arms training at platoon level, emphasis on flanking maneuvers, and prohibitions on unsupported frontal assaults. Training exercises at Fort Knox now simulated German-style defenses, forcing cadets to probe with infantry in air before committing armor.